So let me start with an idea about the city. Think of the city as a space where our major challenges of all sorts land. They become concrete, they become urgent, but they also demand action. So, for instance, on the environmental front, national governments spent years in meetings talking about something to do. But long before Kyoto existed and any of the other treaties, two cities as different, with absolutely different political types of leadership, as Tokyo and LA, Los Angeles, in the early 1980s, adopted CO2 emission controls. They had to, because people in those cities couldn't breathe anymore. It didn't even depend on the politics of the leadership. They had to do it. When there is massive flooding in a city, the leadership has to act. What is the city? What is that particular space which cannot be flattened into everything that is urbanized and built up? What is the city? And just to give you a quick definition, just to be on the same page, I think of the city as a complex system, but an incomplete system. And in that incompleteness then lies the possibility for its longevity. It can keep adapting, incorporating, changing itself, mutating. And that is also partly why the city is a space where you can act on major challenges. If I'm a global firm and I'm sort of debating what global city should I go to. Now, we did a big study. As I said, I participated in a whole bunch of these studies, but I want to emphasize one because it looked at a vast number of variables, and it was through interviews with firms and the objective conditions that firms confronted. Now, overall, yes, London came out on top. Second, yes, was New York. Third was Tokyo and Paris, etc., some of that. But when you begin to break down, and I'm just going to hope that somebody can see some of this. Can you see that? Anyhow, you don't need, I can just tell you that it's New York, and this is the overall ranking. It's London, New York, Tokyo, etc., and then it goes on. Now, if you ask for very specific issues, and here, what I'm trying to get is that no leading city ranks at the top of everything. And in fact, cities like New York, in that same study, with those same firms, and those same sort of inputs, if you want, from the actual issues that firms confront, there was enormous variability. On some of these, New York ranked 56 and London 49th. The main point that I'm trying to make is that a vast number of firms are not interested in coming to the top global cities because that ranking doesn't work for them. And secondly, that different cities have different strengths and also weaknesses. On the environmental question, and to me this question of the capabilities that cities have is critical. I think that one of the options that a city gives, unlike other settings, unlike a mine, unlike a cornfield, is that in its complexity, and in that complexity lie also these capabilities of cities. It allows a kind of engagement of the biosphere, complex, multiscalar, made up of multiple ecologies, and the city. I'm trying to understand all the extraordinary, really, discoveries that biologists are making in the lab, in the laboratory, to sort of, if you want, replace what we now do with chemicals and with machines, etc., with biospheric capabilities. Two examples. One example, they discovered a bacteria which thrives in dirty brown waters. You know, that is what we collectively produce in vast quantities, and which is for most cities a problem. Now, these are organic dirty waters. This bacteria as it lives in these waters, it takes a bit of time, produces a molecule of something that is akin to plastic. Resistant, durable, but biodegradable. In other words, that which is now a burden, a cost, which we dispose of in very problematic ways, becomes an input for the making of a basic product, plastic, that we use in everything. Now, for me, this means that there is this little invisible space between the city and the biosphere that is now underutilized, or at best has been destroyed with our bad practices, that we need to recover, and that in-between space is precisely that connecting. It's like a third nature, that connecting of urban capabilities, because of the complexity, because of the multitude of buildings, because of the multitude of people producing organic brown waters, etc. And again, that is just an example. This is something that you can do at scales in the city that you cannot do in other space. Third issue that I want to talk about is the social question. Now, yes, cities have capabilities, but extremes of inequality, extremes, of negative conditions that divide, are capable of undermining those capabilities that cities have. This is a graph that is all you need is the shape. I know you can't read the numbers. This is a graph that tells a story. It tells a story, this is about an economic trend. It tells a story about how economies are made and economies are governed. And they can be governed in many different ways, and they can be made in many different ways. So the figures that you have here, I don't have no. They go from this is the United States. Now, I use the United States because in its extreme character, the United States is sort of it's heuristic again. It tells a larger story. If you were going to do that for Britain, you would have much less of an extreme curve. So it begins in 1917. It really ends in 2009 with the latest census. It just got cut off there. What it shows is the share of earnings, salaries that are taken in by the top 10% of earners. The top 10% of earners have other sources of earnings, clearly capital gains, inherited wealth. But this just looks at that. And in the adorable 1920s and 30s, when we had a bit of a crisis there, they took in about 47% of all the earnings generated in the economy of the United States. This is individual, so in other words, not household income. Then it falls sharply, 1942 till 1987. Those decades in the curve are the adorable Keynesian decades, when in fact their share falls. I mean, it's still a very robust share. It's 33%. The graph doesn't demonstrate it, but it signals behind that fall is the growth of a prosperous middle class. Now, and then 1987 is when the new era begins, and you see it reaches, in fact, the same levels as it did in the 1920s and 30s. Now, here is a contradiction. Those adorable Keynesian decades are years of mass production, mass building of suburbs, and the cities are getting poorer. If you look at Paris, I'm just looking at the US, if you look at Paris, if you look at London, London, in fact, in the 70s was broke. Tokyo was broke, officially bankrupt. New York was broke. You look at all the European continental cities, which are always sort of a more moderate version of it all, especially Northwest, etc. And they all were getting poorer. They lost share of national income. Then, when 1987 and this increased inequality comes, cities become again important. The function that they have at that point is a strategic function. Really, I think of global cities actually as a space of production to produce complex organizational capabilities that firms, museums, governments, no matter who wants to operate globally, needs. It is a period charged with contradictions. We have seen it, rebuilding of central areas. Well, it has come with a price, expelling other people. Now, I quickly wanted to show, this is just the curve of, if you take from 1979, this is again the United States, to 2009, the top, what do we have here? The top 1%, 300% growth. The bottom 40%, I don't know if you can see it, barely grew. Yet we have a sense that these were decades of enormous prosperity. And part of the story is that the visual order of cities, all that rebuilding, all that upgrading, suggested prosperity, prosperity, and you have a 20% of the middle class that is richer than they ever thought they would be. But it is a complex and contradictory story. I'm just want to say one comment, and I think that finance is a critical factor enabling a lot of this growth, but it is also a critical factor in producing many negative outcomes, of course, including the crises. And this is, to me, an image that captures the basics of finance. Credit default swaps, in 6 years, they grew from less than $1 trillion to 62 trillion. Think of any 62 trillion, you know the zeros, lots of zeros. I know that on the continent it often is slightly different designation, but you know what I mean. And tell me any sector that can generate that scale of growth. 62 trillion is more than global GDP at that time, which stood at 54 trillion. Overall value of financial assets, notional value, as measured by outstanding derivatives, 630 trillion. 14 times and a half global GDP. This is all for 2008, 2007, when the crisis hadn't quite. That is an extraordinary capability. Part of all the rebuilding that we have seen is because some of that, whatever notional value is pulled down and materialized into the fantastic Olympic park, into a high-speed train system, into whatever. So but some of it has not, right? Too much of it was not. So one of the lessons, I would say, of this era, of this moment, and I'm sure that there are business people here, I would like to hear what they have to say, is let finance do its stuff of inventing value in a way that traditional banking does not. But by God, bring it down and materialize it into social housing, into et cetera, et cetera. So the question of governing, how an economy is governed, is extremely important. And here I come back to the notion that the city is a space that is showing you right there. Yes, you have built all this new stuff, but you know what? You have slums, not here, but you have growing poverty. You have homelessness. The homelessness are lying right there. So the city's talking back. Yes, you built all of this beautiful stuff, but. Now, again, I'm fascinated by finance. I think it is both destructive, and it can also be a source for building social housing. Now, this is a market where the minimum price of the housing varies across cities. So it's a modest $7 million in Shanghai, and it is 25 million in London, in Monaco, and a few other cities. This is a minimum price if you don't reach those prices in those cities. Now, what does that do? That means it can be Mac mansions, it doesn't have to, but that actually deurbanizes the city. So that is not such a great aspect. So the city matters more and more for the environmental question, for the social question, for the capabilities that allow us to make capitals that we can invest in what we need, and we need a lot of housing, we need a lot of et cetera, et cetera. And these things, massive inequalities, abuse of financial capabilities, these kinds of surveillance systems, a lot of stuff that is not urban takes a very sharp form in the space of the city. And that is why we need to protect these complex, messy, slightly anarchic spaces that are cities. Thank you.